Okay, welcome everyone to Harrison Public Library program. It's our official kickoff for summer reading, and our library is pleased to have award-winning author Stacey Lee, who is joining us today, and she is our summer reading ambassador. She will be discussing her new book, and our programming and outreach librarian Giovanna Iannacci will introduce Stacey Lee and talk a little bit more about her work.
Thank you, Galina. Thank you, and thank you, Stacey, for joining us tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce Stacey Lee to you. She is an award-winning author of historical and contemporary young adult fiction, including Under a Painted Sky, Outrun the Moon, winner of the 2017 Penn Center Award for Young Adult Fiction, and the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association YA Book of the Year. The Secret of a Heart Note, which sold in 8 countries. The Downstairs Girl, which received 5-star reviews and which Booklist called, quote, spectacular. And her latest novel, Luck of the Titanic. Stacey's books have been selected for the Amelia Bloomer List for Feminist Fiction, as well as the YA Library Services Association's Best Fiction for Young Adults list, and the New York Public Library's Best Books for Teens. Luck of the Titanic has been praised as, quote, an exciting, important retelling of the Titanic tragedy, end quote, by the Library School Journal. Quote, a gem from start to bittersweet finish, end quote, by Kirkus Review, and Publishers Weekly has praised the novel as, quote, a finely crafted historical exploration of identity, class, and family that resonates through the present, end quote. A native of Southern California and 4th-generation Chinese American, Stacey is a founder of the We Need Diverse Books movement and writes stories for all kids, even the ones who look like adults. Please join me in welcoming the Harrison Library Summer Reading Ambassador, Stacey Lee.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's so nice to be here, and thank you to the Harrison Public Library for asking me to be your summer reading ambassador. I'm so honored to share my books and my love of books with you. So today I'm specifically talking about Luck of the Titanic, which came out a little over a month ago. And it's been such a thrill to invite people to learn more about the Titanic, even the ones who, thought they knew it all. As a writer of historical fiction, I'm always looking for those stories that fall into the cracks with the heroes and the heroines that you didn't know about, who don't always get mentioned in the history books. So you'd think me writing a story about the Chinese people on the Titanic would sort of be a no-brainer, but I was actually quite reluctant to write this story. So I thought it would be fun to tell you kind of how it all went down. So in the fall of 2017, an email appeared in my inbox. It was one of those forwarded group emails that my Chinese Canadian mother-in-law enjoys sending me of interesting articles she's come across having to do with our Asian heritage. She's very invested in us knowing about our roots. I'm 4th generation, as mentioned, and my kids are 5th generation, and such things can be lost. So I don't always read her articles right away, but this one definitely caught my eye. New film reveals fate of Chinese survivors of Titanic. I was really quite puzzled, wondering how the words Chinese and Titanic might belong in the same sentence. Turns out there were actually 8 Chinese men aboard the Titanic. I had never heard of any Chinese sailing on the Titanic, much less survivors. And judging by all the emphatic responses that came to my mother-in-law's email, mostly from her family and her friends, who were mostly seniors like herself and had seen many things around the world, and including all the Titanic museums, they had not heard of them either. So the article was about a team of British documentarians who were using social media callouts to puzzle out what had happened to the survivors. The 8 Chinese passengers were actually seamen bound for a new route in the Caribbean after a coal strike in England birthed their own steamships. They were being transported to this new route. They were the largest group of non-European or North American passengers, actually, sailing on this ocean liner. And a remarkable 6 of them survived. So I asked myself, why had I never heard of these passengers? And how did 75% of them survive when the survival rate of the third class passengers was more like 25%? Well, these questions bothered me, but I was in the throes of writing The Dance Chips Girl, a YA book centered in a different part of the world in a different century. Specifically Atlanta, 1890. And I didn't really have space in my brain to nurture a story set on the cold waters of the Atlantic. In fact, I didn't think that I could even write a story about the Titanic, even after I had finished the last book. I didn't know much about the Titanic beyond what I had seen in James Cameron's movie. I knew, classism, not enough lifeboats, and I remember Rose throwing her necklace into the sea and being kind of mad at that. And though I loved a good ocean faring story, I just felt ill-equipped to write one. I'm one of those people who get very seasick, even in like an elevator, and I did not know much about how ships worked. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to spend too much time, figuring that out. But as much as I tried to elbow a story about the Chinese on the Titanic away, the idea had already begun to take hold in my mind. Here was a chance to bring attention to a story that had not yet been told. Here was a chance to show the far-reaching effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act, an act that from 1882 to 1943 banned an entire race from coming to the United States. For that was the reason you never heard about these men. Every Titanic survivor, 705 in all, was allowed entry into the United States without question and given aid and medical relief. After all, papers and money had been lost in the catastrophe. And this is a picture of some of the passengers who were, right after the disaster, were given a place to stay and money, but not the Chinese. They were sent away within 24 hours of arriving in New York simply because of how they looked. Worse, they were shamed for surviving. Newspapers vilified them as cowards who had hidden under the seats to survive or had dressed up as women, none of which were true. And for Chinese, being shamed is often considered worse than death. So many of these survivors did not tell their stories to their families. Another reason so little is known about them. So researching this book wasn't easy. There's lots of information on the Titanic, but not so much on the Chinese passengers. The film that my mother-in-law's email referenced, The Six, had not yet been released, and the British documentarians did not respond to my requests for information. There might have been like some confidentiality agreements in place. I'm not quite sure. The Six recently had a debut in China as of April this year, but still hasn't been released in the United States. So I'm anxiously awaiting to see this documentary. But with so little to go on when I was writing the book, I focused my efforts on learning about the Chinese sailors who had been working and living in England at the time. Many of them came from Hong Kong or Guangdong. They probably spoke little English after the iceberg hit with chaos swirling around them. I guess they might not have understood the emergency orders from the crew and just tried to do what they could to survive, get themselves on a lifeboat. So actually the last person recovered from the Titanic was a Chinese man. He was found floating on a door. And in fact, his plight inspired the scene in the James Cameron movie in which Rose survives by clinging to a door and not sharing the door with Jack. Crewmen were reluctant to pick him up because they actually thought he was a Jap. But it's a good thing they did because he ended up rowing the lifeboat to safety. James Cameron actually showed this man on a door in his movie, but ultimately deleted that scene. So Luck of the Titanic is not the true story of the Chinese passengers on the Titanic. It is the story of the acrobat Valora, a British Chinese girl who boards Titanic, hoping to convince her twin brother, a sailor who was traveling with his company of Chinese seamen, to the audition for the Ringling Brothers Circus and go with her to America. An investor in the Ringling Brothers Circus was an actual passenger aboard the Titanic. And this is one of the things I really love about writing historical fiction, being able to weave in historical details into my story. And certainly some of the things I learned during the research process lend themselves to the storyline. For example, I didn't know I was going to write about acrobats. I didn't know my heroine was going to be an acrobat until I learned this fact about the Ringling Brothers investor. So Valora has a ticket, but she doesn't have the proper documents to allow her into the US under an exception to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So she must stow away, and she ends up impersonating a first-class passenger, because you can't have a Titanic book without showing a little how the other half lives. And so that's how I was able to incorporate some of the first class and the third class, and a little bit of the second class, who I know often gets left out of Titanic stories. Whenever I do research, I always start with a map. And here's a picture of me with I had ordered a blueprint of the Titanic. And as you can see, it was like large enough to fit on my dining room table. It's really how I get my bearings to get a map or blueprint. Titanic had 9 decks, and the ship was designed so that the first, second, and third class would not ever accidentally meet, because that would be awkward. But of course, the design and the sort of confusing layout, many think is responsible for why the third class had so much trouble getting to the boat deck, which is where the lifeboats were kept. So I just wanted to show this picture because I think it was a substantial part of my research to understand how this boat worked. I used a magnifying glass right here, and you can see that I colored in parts of it to help me understand who went where. It takes me about 6 months to a year for me to do all the research before I start writing the story. So even if what happened to these Chinese men is never fully known, it is my hope that Luck of the Titanic will give these men a permanent place on the ship of dreams. And I think I'll stop there. And Giovanna, would you like me to do a little, is there time to read a little bit?
Yes, definitely, please.
Okay, so I'm just gonna read a little bit of the first chapter. Oh, there's my glasses. Okay, just a little bit of the opening. And I wish I knew how to do an English accent, but that would be not good for anyone. April 10th, 1912. When my twin Jamie left, he vowed it wouldn't be forever. Only a week before Halley's Comet brushed the London skies, he kissed my cheek and set off. One comment in, one comment out. But 2 years away is more than enough time to clear his head, even in the cold thickened air at the bottom of a steamship. Since he hasn't come home, it is time to chase down the comet's tail. I try not to fidget while I wait my turn on the first class gangway of White Star Line's newest ocean liner. A roofed corridor, to spare the knobs the inconvenience of sunshine, leads directly from the boat train depot to this highest crossing. At least we are far from the rats on Southampton dock below, which is crawling with them. Of course, some up here might consider me a rat. The couple ahead of me eyes me warily, even though I am dressed in one of Mrs. Sloane's smartest traveling suits, shark gray to match her usual temper, with a swath of black beeswarm lace pinned from shoulder to shoulder. A lifetime with those dodgy looks teaches you to ignore them. Haven't I already survived the journey from London? A half-day's travel packed into a smoky rail car next to a man who stank of sardines. And here I am, so close to the finish line, I can nearly smell Jamie, like trampled ryegrass and the milk biscuits he is so fond of eating. An ocean breeze cools my cheeks. Several stories below in either direction, onlookers crowd the dock, staring up at the ship rising 6 stories before them. Its hull gleams, a wall of liquid black with a quartet of smokestacks so wide you could drive a train through them. Stately letters march across its side. Titanic. On the third-class gangway, 100 feet to my left, passengers sport a variety of costume. Headscarves, patterned caftans, fringed shawls of botany wood, tasseled caps, and plain dungarees and straw hats. I don't see a single Chinese face among them. Has Jamie boarded already? With this crowd, I may have missed him. Then again, he isn't traveling alone, but with 7 other Chinese men from his company. All are being transported to Cuba for a new route after coal strikes here burnt their steamship. Something cold unspools in my belly. I received his last letter a month ago. Time enough for things to change. What if Jamie's company decided to send them somewhere other than Cuba? Maybe a new route in Asia or Africa. The line shifts, only a few more passengers ahead of me. Jamie, I call in my mind, a game I often played growing up. He doesn't always hear, but I like to think he does when it matters. In China, a dragon phoenix pair of boy-girl twins is considered auspicious. And so Bob bought 2 suckling pigs to celebrate our birth, roasted side by side to show their common lot. Some may think that macabre, but to the Chinese, death is just a continuation of life on a higher plane with our ancestors. Jamie, your sister is here. Look for me. So that's a little bit about Luck of the Titanic. And I think I'll stop there. And then maybe if there are people who have questions, that'll give us some time to answer.
Yes, you can, anyone who has a question, you can type it in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute, you can also unmute and ask your question. I just finished it, or I should say early this morning, because I wanted to make sure I finished it, and yeah, it just grabbed me right away, and I shared with Stacey that it was a little heartbreaking, but very beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you.
I can start us off with a question, and this is about, while everyone thinks of their questions, I'll start us off. When you were planning for the book, you mentioned you did your research about 6 months to 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So did you have it all mapped out, all outlined, you know, in terms of some writers know the ending before they've even written the introduction kind of thing? Did you know how you were going to end the novel?
Yeah, well, I knew I wanted to stick to the historical fact that 6 out of 8 survived, but that would mean that 2 died, and then, you know, we add Valora to the mix, so there's actually, in my book, 9 Chinese. So I knew 3 would, but I think I did not know which ones it was going to be. I had an idea, actually, of who I thought would have to go, such as the tragedy of the Titanic, right? You got to make those hard choices. But even up until the end, even after I had turned in edits, usually during the publishing process, there's a series of edits, and I would say there were probably 3 major rounds where I turned something into my editor and she turned something back to me, and then I turned something back to her. So 3 turnarounds. Even by, I believe it was the 2nd turnaround, I was still changing the ending. So I think for me, it was definitely a process of figuring out whose character needed that kind of ending, which ending. So yeah, I would like to say I know generally what happens, but the specifics often are up for change according to what I think feels natural and right for each character. And I am not one of those people who fastidiously outlines. I'm definitely not one of those people. I'm more, we call it in the industry, we call it a pantster. The technical term is writing by the seat of your pants. And I mean, that's not completely true. I do sort of write out some of the emotional beats I'd like to hit, but I really am open to what my research uncovers, and writing according to what I've found interesting details. Is such an organic process for me. So I find that if I outline too much, it becomes too difficult to stay within those bounds.
Okay. We do have a few questions in the chat. Caitlin Doyle would like to know who inspired April from Luck of the Titanic.
Oh, April. Yeah, April was also a late addition to the story. I find that when I am writing books, I like to have a confidant, and a friend. And and I realized when I was writing the story that Valora's mostly communicating with these 8 Chinese men, and she and Jamie have sort of been on their own when they were growing up in England, being sort of both looking Chinese and not really fitting in well with society there. So she's never grown up with a lot of girlfriends. And I think that was part of the journey I wanted to bring her on, is realizing that Jamie is not solely her life, and that there are other people who she can connect with. So April was a late addition after I realized that Valora really needed some friends. and then it was also gave me a chance to introduce some of the fashion, which I love.
Yeah, I love the fashion. An offshoot to that, the question with the fashion, were you looking to actual designs from that period, when like the peacock dress and the
Yes. And that's one of the fun parts about the research, I think, is understanding how women were dressing and what that meant, why they were dressing that way. And yeah, it was, women were, finally being loosened from their stays. No one wore corsets, right, anymore, and hemlines were coming up. So it was definitely becoming a lot more casual than the Victorian era. And I really loved finding out all the little details about what they considered important. Hats were not quite so huge anymore, or not quite so busy as they had been. And I saw April as really being on the cutting edge and leading the foray into a more modern period of dress.
Yeah. So a few more questions are coming in. This is great. HC would like to know, what was your writing process? How many drafts did you make before you reached the final one?
Yeah, oof. Yeah, there is, I think, several. I mean, I think the thing that changed the most was getting Valora onto the ship was the hardest part for me. At one point, she was locking herself into a wine crate and being, lifted in that, and then she falls out and she's in the ocean and she has to swim her way. I mean, it got pretty complicated. Yeah, I think just getting her on board the ship was difficult, especially because there were tickets, and there were lots of crewmen, and there were lots of people around who could see her. But also trying to work in some of her acrobatic strengths was challenging. I think that beginning must have changed at least 10 times. I mean, completely different scenarios where, somebody shoots a gun and everybody looks at him, and then she can sneak aboard, and just all sorts of scenarios. And I think it was necessary for me to write all those just to see how they would play out and find out the angles that didn't work. At one point, there was a group of prostitutes who helped her get in. So it was, I guess it was fun. It was a lot of work, but ultimately that had to go. And I feel like I think that's why I can't outline, because I need to play with so many different possibilities. Yeah, and then the first draft actually took place entirely on in the third class areas, I didn't have her sneaking into the first class, which I realized a critique partner pointed out, oh, well, then you're not going to be able to show the first class. And that's kind of sad because people think of Titanic and they think of the first class. And she had a really good point, which is why I mentioned that in my talk. So I think that revision was probably a major revision. Just basically, I had to scrap half the book.
It seems like you partially answer Melanie's question. She's asking, was the ending of the book planned from the beginning, or did it change in the process?
The ending. Oh, yes. Yeah. The ending changed quite a bit because I had my ideas of who was going to die, and that turned out wasn't what needed to happen. And actually, it's difficult to talk about these things without spoiling them. And actually, so I'm sort of carefully stepping around my words, but my editor and I kind of had disagreements over that. There were many emails back and forth because I had changed things from where they originally stood at a pretty late process in the game, and she really wanted me to think about that. I think she was really happy with how the first ending came out and was reluctant to have me change it. And so, and actually that change, the ending of the book, changing that required me to go through and make things a different tense. And as anyone has ever, if there are any writers who have ever tried to change one tense to another tense, present to past or present or something like that, it's a lot of work, and it's not just an even one-for-one exchange of has to have or whatever. It's a more, I don't know, qualitative change. Yeah, so these definitely, I'm happy with how it turned out, but I think I do like to tell writers that it was definitely a long discussion for how the book should have ended between the editorial team, myself, and yeah. So, but I think that when you wrestle over something, you end up with a better result. So that part, the struggle means that you've really thought about things well, and it means that you've really honed in on the perfect ending. I think I needed that struggle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maybe another question, but a statement. I haven't finished your book yet, but it's hard not to notice the topic of discrimination, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and how you show us blueprint and Titanic was built so people from first class and third class cannot interact, and just to me it's very noticeable in the book. You can't avoid it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And most of the Titanic stuff that you see is focused on, you know, the classes on first, second, third class, less between the second and the first class, but really the third and the first. The third class, one interesting fact I learned was that there was one bathtub for all those passengers. Whereas in the first class, of course, everyone had their bath. Well, not everybody, but there were a lot of bathrooms in the first class. And yes, it's true, people didn't bathe as much back then, but that was quite stark to realize, one bathtub for everybody to share. Having even said that, though, the third class on the Titanic was a pretty posh place compared to other steerage in other boats. So I'm sure it was nicer than many third class were used to, but still, the first class was like, wow, pretty posh.
Yeah. Thank you. Our high school librarian, Catherine, is wondering, which do you enjoy more, the research on the writing, or how do you keep track of your research? Research or the writing, and how do you keep track of your research?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Research or the writing? I like both for different reasons. I think the research is interesting to me. I often get stuck in research holes, black holes, and that part is not fun to dig myself out. I end up going down different paths and thinking, oh wow, this would be great, and then I've like completely veered away from. An example is in the Downstairs Girl. I got really lost in I got lost in a very dark tunnel, and I started becoming really outraged by the plight of Black men always being accused of doing things to white women, and it was unfair, and I was just being outraged at that. And I realized that my book took a very dark turn, and it started to become more about a side character than it became about my character. So that's a lesson I'm always trying to keep in mind, that it's okay to go down these black holes of research, but it's also I also have to be mindful of what my original story is about, and try to sort of steer myself back into the lane. And yeah, so that part, research with a caveat that I can't go into many black holes. But the story part is, my first love, I guess, is story writing. So if I had to choose, I would say story. Yeah, the writing the story is the funner part for me.
Thank you.
Okay, there are a few other questions, and I'm not going in the order. Sorry about that, but I will get to everyone's questions. How did you find? HC would like to know, how did you find beta readers, and roughly how many did you have?
Oh, beta readers. Yeah, I find that as I write each book, I get fewer beta readers just because I have less time to write the books. I don't know why this is. The deadlines start looming a little larger for me. So in this case, I had about 5 readers, and going into the editorial process. After the editorial process, I continued to use beta readers, especially, I mentioned I changed that ending and it was so significant. So I brought in a few beta readers at the end to help me figure out what was the right thing to do. It was definitely a collaboration, I think. Where I got feedback from other authors who had been in the same position and who gave me some advice on what to do and what to expect and things to think about. And I really appreciate them for that. Yeah, so I'd say for past books, I would have anywhere between 10 to 20, and this one probably 0 to 12. Not 0, about 12. Yeah, about 12 ultimately. Yeah, but I think at a certain point you have to really trust your instincts as well. I think ultimately for me, even with getting all this feedback, it was great to help me understand what I should be thinking about. But that decision was ultimately up to me. So I had to really trust myself.
Okay, next question. This is Melanie Gonzalez. Did you have a favorite thing you learned during your research process on the Titanic?
Oh, yeah, I did not know much about Titanic, as I've mentioned. And I think what I really enjoyed was there are so many, several things. I enjoyed learning about how the ship worked and how there were these engines. Like, you see mostly what's going on with the passengers, but you don't see a lot about what's happening in the bowels of the ship, with all the furnaces and all the men needed to keep that going, and the electricians, and how that looked from a worker's perspective. And I really liked learning about that and seeing, you didn't see that part, but there were a lot of people making that happen. And those crewmen really sacrificed, they kept it on to the end. They kept the lights on, the electricians kept the lights on to the end. So quite the unsung heroes of the boat. And then I guess I just enjoyed seeing all the documentaries on Titanic. And this gave me an opportunity to watch the work of others and to not just James Cameron's movie, but there have been hundreds of things made about Titanic. And it was a joy to be able to see the different angles people have taken on this incredible story, which still continues to captivate people.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And related to that, who is your favorite character to write in Luck of the Titanic?
Oh. I liked Valora. I liked writing Valora because she's kind of a heroine that I'm not like her very much. And it was fun to put myself in her frame of mind where she's very, dominant and bossy and sort of in charge and knows what she wants and confident and wisecracking. I'm the person who never thinks of a good remark to say until, days later, sometimes years. So it was fun to be able to take on her persona and put myself into her mindset. I also did like writing about the friendship between Wink and Ollie. They were fun because they reminded me so much of my son, which now he's older and not that age anymore, but at the time I really was thinking about him. He's who I dedicated the book to. So it was fun seeing the Titanic through their eyes too. Middle grade boys, essentially.
Yeah. Caitlin Doyle has a comment. Interesting fact, there was one Black family on the Titanic.
That's right. It's a Haitian man. And he actually was traveling in second class. And there was also a Japanese man and several Middle Eastern. And yeah, you never hear these stories. It's so fascinating to see all the colors on Titanic. These are all immigrants, like they were, well, maybe not all immigrants, but many of them were just in search of a better life. Yeah.
And Jovi, our adult librarian, has a question, well, a comment and a question. I loved your book, The Secret of a Heart Note, which is a departure from your historical fiction novels. What was your inspiration for writing this particular story, The Secret of a Heart Note?
Well, that was inspired sort of through my nose. I have this very weird ability to smell musical pitches through my nose. I have musical perfect pitch, and I think that somehow translates to my nose. So when I smell something like a cup of coffee, I can tell you, oh, that's a D flat. And usually musical pitches, usually the smells that you smell are made up of many pitches. So, but there are dominant pitches that I can identify. And I, completely useless skill to have, but it did inspire this one book. So I thank it for that. It's about a perfumer and her mother who make love potions and use their noses to find all these different plants in order to create these potions. And she accidentally fixes the mother of the school soccer, the hot soccer star, with the math teacher. So she's got to fix her mistake. And that's what that's about. And it was super fun. It was actually one of the most fun books to write because it was very whimsical, I think. And I really enjoyed all the, no one remembers Freaky Friday anymore, do they? Freaky Friday, that Disney movie where, things go wrong. Well, it kind of had that feel to me. And it was just funny to like make everything go wrong.
It sounds good though. Now I've added to my list. So we have G who read The Downstairs Girl who has read that The Downstairs Girl is being adapted for a series. Do you know of any plans for Luck of the Titanic? Will it be hitting screens soon?
That's a great question. I believe it's currently being shopped and I believe there's interest. So I can't tell you more than that, but I hope that it pans out. In fact, I'm meeting both of those. I'm meeting some people who were working on selling that tomorrow. And so hopefully I'll get some news.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Well, how'd that be? So I could just see, well, I haven't read Downstairs Girl yet. It's on my list, but I could see the luck of the Titanic visually on the big screen. It has that intensity too.
Yeah, I think it would be super fun to have a new Titanic story. Yeah, I'm not, and I think that there's a lot of things happening technology-wise that allow you to make these kind of movies now.
Right.
With the ocean, without having to build these huge sets like, James Cameron had done.
Right.
Ocean and destroying the ship.
But it would be nice. It would be a perspective from a young adult and from a Chinese perspective. Someone who's part British, part Chinese, and all of what's encountered with that, the challenges with that on the ship.
And in fact, I was asking my daughter if she's ever, well, before I started writing the book, I asked her if she and her friends had seen the Titanic movie, and I couldn't remember if she had, but her friends had not, and so her generation, Leonardo DiCaprio, yeah, he's like an old dude, and
yeah.
So no, they don't want to watch that. So I feel like they know about the Titanic, but it would be fun to have it on the screen.
Yes. Well, we'll be sending thoughts to whoever's producing and creating and developing for it to happen.
Yeah.
So Katherine Johnson, our high school librarian, Harrison High School librarian, has a question. I noticed you said that you have a son. Your books generally have female heroines. Does your son enjoy your books, and is he a reader?
Yeah, so he's now 15, and he read all my books except for The Secret of a Heart Note, because when that came out, he thought it was like early kissing, whatever. But he liked all the other books, and he has not read this book yet. In fact, this is the copy I read for you was from his was his actual book, and he's like that much through the book.
Okay.
Just a little, but he went to camp, so he is not. He's not been able to finish it yet. But,
okay.
Yeah, he is a reader. I think now at his age, that teenage boys that now they're playing Minecraft. But I'm always encouraging him to read every day. So here's hoping he continues that habit into adulthood. It is hard though, because I feel like he's always looking for things, and he knows that women heroines are so much fun, and he can really connect with them. He knows that just because I forced him to read so many years. But I think that there is this mentality that boys are not going to be interested in a story written from a girl's perspective, which is totally untrue. So yeah, and actually I dedicated this book to him because I loved being able to talk about Chinese males. And so many of my books are focused on the female experience. So I thought this is finally he can see the Chinese male as a hero.
Yeah, and the dialogue, there's a lot of dialogue among the young men, which I thought was very interesting too. Culturally, and then also from the male versus female, which is I think prevalent in all cultures, wherever you go.
Yeah.
HC has a question about whether you have ever had the imposter syndrome when writing. If so, how did you deal with it?
Oh my gosh, all the time. In fact, every time I sit down to write a book, I forget, and I question whether or not I know how to do this anymore because I don't know. I think it's just something that you always wonder, it's hard to write a book and it's hard to keep track of everything in your head, and it can be kind of overwhelming. How do I deal with it? I think it's something that comes and goes, and I think that's just part of the process. Like questioning yourself always will lead to a better, like a better product, I think. And because I think if you're too confident, then you're putting your ego before the story. And so I feel like for me, I always have to be in that humble position where I'm just in the background. I'm just telling the story. I'm just trying to get it to you, just trying to get it into your hands. Like, I want to share this thing with you and give you this experience, put you in this time machine and like give you a chance to travel back to the past. I don't really want to be in the picture at all. When I was growing up, I thought authors, and that was a different time where authors really didn't have to be on social media or anything. And that was my hope. That's what I was hoping as a writer. I'm going to just be in my writing cave. I'm just going to produce a story for you to read, and I'm going to be out of the picture. So this being on social media and talking to you is kind of something I didn't expect. I realize that I do enjoy it, but I'm definitely always going to be that writer who it just wants to give you the story and sort of like let you have it, and then sort of tiptoe away.
Now, what is, Danielle would like to know, your biggest piece of advice for aspiring writers?
I would say, don't write those things that you think are going to be, don't write because of other people's opinions about what's going to be a hit. I feel like there was a time where vampire stories were really big and everybody wanted to write a vampire story. You know how that worked out. Vampire stories fell out of fashion, and then you had all these writers with vampire stories that didn't sell. So I think you should listen to your voice and write the thing that you're passionate about and that speaks to you and that you can offer your own perspective on, your own unique voice to. Being true to that, I think, is the way to go. Because trends come and go. Your voice is you, and it's not going to come and go. That is you. The other thing I would say is not to quit on your worst day, because this industry can really really break you down, and there's a lot of competition, and you're going to have days where you feel like, why am I doing this? Why am I bothering to do yet another revision? But there's always tomorrow, and there's always, you're going to be able to sleep and rejuvenate yourself, and you're going to come back at it again, because that is what you were meant to do. You're meant to be a writer. I think we all have that ability to be writers. We all are writers. As soon as we write down something, we are writers, and we're all storytellers. So that is not something that's going to go away. So if you want to be a writer, don't quit on your worst day. You can make it happen.
Excellent. So Laura would like to know, to what extent do you see your works as advocacy for Asian American representation? Are there efforts to introduce your books in schools to enrich the curriculum?
Well, as for that last part of that question, I hope so. I think so. I do see my books on reading lists, and that always encourages me. I definitely am writing stories that I hope will show girls in all their forms and formulations, all their different diversity. There's not just one Asian American story, there's so many. And as I've mentioned, fourth generation, this is a story about someone who's first generation, but there's all the generations in between, all the different parts of Asia one can come from, so many different identities. And so I'm just adding one little one because I hope to show the breadth that is out there. When I was growing up, there were no Asian American stories on the bookshelves. Really, there was not. I saw one young adult. It was not even young adult. It was an adult about a young adult. It was a memoir called The Fifth Chinese Daughter by Jade Snow Wong. And that was really the only book that I saw through my teen years where there was an Asian American heroine. And so now that, because of the We Need Diverse Books movement, I think has really change that formulation has really highlighted the need for more diverse voices on the bookshelf. And now we are seeing more different voices, which is very exciting to me. One thing I always am mindful of is stereotypes. And I always want to write against the stereotype. And I mean, I think the stereotypes of Asian women are that we're submissive and exotic and brainy. And I think those can really hurt us. And so I want to show heroines who are very, three-dimensional, who are not always brainy or not always beautiful or beautiful in different ways. And I think it's really important to go against those stereotypes because that's what we see in media. Even I was at the movies, I was seeing In the Heights last week. It was a great movie, but there was a preview of a movie with an submissive Asian woman. And I was kind of cringing because it's still with us. And so I'm always trying to change that. Yeah.
Excellent question. So we have time for one more question if anyone, or if I didn't get to your question, please feel free to retype it in. If by some chance I missed it, was not purposeful.
May I?
Yeah? Yes, please.
Yes, Stacey, I was going to say, as our reading ambassador, you probably know we're reading The Downstairs Girl in the Millennium Book Club next month. And our discussion is going to be August 11th. Perhaps you can join us for questions. Join our discussion. We'll be on Zoom.
Okay, email me. I would love to talk to you.
Okay.
This is for the Teenage Book Club?
No, this is actually our Millennium Book Club, which is open to anyone. Our Millennium Book Club, and we'll be discussing, and we often read YA books as well.
Okay,
I've read John Green, and they're reading your book, and we've done other YA books in the past. So that's our Millennium Book Club. But it is, if teens want to join us, they're more than welcome to. And I think the Rye Teen Book Club has also read it. They read it a few months back. So hopefully they'll join for the discussion. And I see some questions that have come up. Caitlin, is racism a big issue for your historical books?
For my historical books, I do show, I mean, mine are historical. And the unfortunate truth is that history has not been kind to the Chinese in America. I write about the Chinese in America, Asian Americans in America. And there is always, I mean, that was, I told you, the Exclusion Act was for over 60 years, excluded Chinese Americans based on race from coming into the United States. So that is a part of our history, and that's always going to sort of be in the backdrop of my stories. That isn't a reality that people were dealing with. Yeah. Maybe
And our
contemporary is not such a big deal. I hope going forward for contemporary stories, has stuff changed much? I don't know. I sometimes think it doesn't. Our change is very slow. We still see that, in the past year and a half or more, there's been a lot of crime against Asian Americans. So I still see history continuing to repeat itself. Hopefully that will change.
Yes, hopefully. It has to change.
Yeah.
It has to change. And last question for tonight, Barbara would like to know, being a fourth generation Asian American, how much research do you have to do on your own culture when writing about it?
Yes, I actually have to do a lot of research into my own culture. Thank you. And for that, I rely on people to share with me, old timers, and people who have family who have gone through things. I do a lot of interviews and talks with people, hearing their stories, and I am always keeping my ears open to learn more. I think, it's interesting because someone else mentioned racism, and that's not something my family, my dad came over in the 40s. My mother was born here in the States, and in San Francisco. And that's not something we talk about as a family growing up. That was more something, I mentioned the idea of shame being like almost worse than death. So having something bad happen to you, like racism, is not something we like to admit or think about. It's not worth it to give the emotional energy to, if that makes sense. So when I started writing books, it really did dredge up a lot of feelings. And, you know, my father was a paper son. That's somebody who has to come in through other papers, you know, that's a side door to get into the United States. And he never talks about that. It was almost like, oh my gosh, no, nobody. I'm like, Dad, you're an American citizen now, you know, you don't have to worry about that. But he won't really talk about that. Yeah, because it's almost like a shameful thing. So I forgot the question. Help me, Giovanna.
It was whether you had to do research as a fourth generation, whether you had to do research on your own culture.
Yes.
About it.
Yes, I did. And it often happens to be painful, like especially when I'm talking to the older generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just put information in the chat about our next program with Stacey, who will be back. We're so lucky that she'll be back August 18th with two other authors talking about why we need diverse books. So we have Olivia Abati and Mitali Perkins, who'll be joining us and Stacey on August 18th. Registration is open. It's the same time as this program, 7 p.m. Eastern time and 4 p.m. Pacific time.